What would you do if the person you once loved most vanished without a goodbye, a note, or a reason, and then, 13 years later, you heard a song only the two of you ever knew? Daniel Whitmore was supposed to have it all, a powerful family legacy, a future carved in stone, and the love of a girl who played music like it was her first language. But one summer, she disappeared, and everyone around him, including his own mother, told him to move on. But what if everything he believed was a carefully constructed lie? A spontaneous trip to a quiet town leads him to a hauntingly familiar melody, and then to her, Maggie, the woman who once held his heart and now guards a secret that changes everything. And then there's the boy, with his eyes, his smile, and maybe his name. If you were Daniel, would you walk away from the life you built, or would you stay and face the truth that was buried for over a decade? This is a story about silence and what happens when it's broken the right way. If you feel the first notes of this story resonate with something deep inside you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this is more than just a story. It's a second chance. Let's begin. The Vermont sky stretched wide and pale, as if winter still lingered behind the spring breeze. Daniel Whitmore adjusted the collar of his coat as he stepped out of the Blacktown car, taking in the quiet street lined with maple trees just beginning to bud. Everhill wasn't on any of his usual travel routes. It wasn't a tech hub or a market opportunity. It wasn't even near a conference center. It was quiet. Too quiet. Perhaps. But that was the point. He had told his assistant he needed 2 days of no noise, no calls, no contracts, no camera-ready meetings. And after 15 years of building Solterra Energy into a national leader in renewable power, that request had felt almost revolutionary, or maybe just human. The boutique inn where he was staying was charming in an old-world way. White shutters, sloping roof, a porch swing that creaked when the wind passed, the kind of place his father would have liked. Daniel checked in, left his bags, and went out to walk. No destination, just his hands in his pockets, and his thoughts trailing behind. It was a soft evening, the kind that hums low in your chest. As he wandered, he passed a small Episcopal church with a garden out front and an old sign that read, "Thursday night music, open to all." He wouldn't have stopped, except he heard it. Just a few notes, soft, tentative, played with fingers that knew not just the chords, but the story between them. It wasn't the melody that stopped him in his tracks. It was the memory inside it. He hadn't heard that song in over a decade. Not anywhere. Not from anyone. It was a piece he had written himself, back when he was a boy with dreams instead of deadlines. A summer when everything still felt possible, and music wasn't a hobby, but a way of speaking. He stepped through the open door at the back of the church, drawn like a man chasing a shadow. The sanctuary was empty except for the flickering light of wall sconces and the soft resonance of a baby grand piano. At the front, seated with quiet focus, was a woman. Her posture was upright, fingers fluid across the keys. She wore a long cardigan over a modest dress, and her shoes were practical, not fashionable. But there was something in the way she moved, not just practiced, but personal. Daniel froze. The light from the stained glass window caught the edge of her profile, a sharp jaw softened by time, a strand of ash-brown hair tucked behind her ear, and above her right brow a faint scar. Faint, but unforgettable. His breath caught. It was her, Maggie Hale. The girl who had once made him believe in music more than money. The woman who had disappeared from his life 13 years ago without a word, without a trace. The one he had never stopped wondering about, even when he told himself it didn't matter anymore. But it did. It always had. She didn't see him. She was lost in the notes, in the memory of a melody that didn't belong to any church hymnal. It belonged to them. He took one slow step back, careful not to make a sound. His heart thundered not from fear, but from something deeper. The ache of unfinished stories, of pages that were never turned. He slipped out before she looked up. Outside, the air was cooler now. The sun had dipped behind the hills. Daniel leaned against the wrought iron railing of the church garden, staring at the violets pushing through the soil. Was this chance fate, or just one more echo from a past he thought had long gone quiet? He stayed there for a while, not moving, not calling anyone, letting the music replay in his mind like a forgotten recording finally found again. There were emails waiting, a call from the board, and a draft speech for next month's Green Energy Summit. But for the first time in years, none of it felt urgent. What mattered had just played out, in a quiet church, in a town he almost didn't come to, in the hands of a woman he thought he'd never see again. And she wasn't alone. Because when the door opened again, he heard another voice inside young, bright, maybe 12 or 13, a boy, asking her a question about the music, and she called him Caleb. Daniel's stomach tightened. The notes, the woman, the boy, the name. He turned away from the church, walked back to the inn slowly, but with his mind already running. He had come here to forget the noise. Instead, he had walked straight into the heart of a memory, or maybe into the beginning of something he was never meant to leave behind. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. He kept hearing the music, every note echoing in the hollow spaces he hadn't realized were still there. And behind the music, her Maggie, after all these years. By morning, the inn's dining room smelled of strong coffee and wood smoke. Daniel sat by the window, untouched plate in front of him, watching the town stir awake. Everhill moved at its own pace, deliberate, unhurried. He wasn't used to that anymore. At 9:15, he folded his napkin, slipped on his coat, and walked. He didn't tell himself where he was going, but his steps led him there anyway, back to the church. The Thursday night sign had been replaced with Friday's community breakfast. All welcome. Inside, folding tables were arranged in rows, flanked by warm chatter, styrofoam cups, and the scent of buttered biscuits. She was there, Maggie, standing behind a table, ladling oatmeal into bowls, her hair pulled back, a navy apron over her sweater. She looked older, of course, but not diminished. There was still that quiet energy about her, focused, steady. She smiled at someone, not a forced, polite smile, but something real, the kind that settled deep in her cheeks and eyes. Daniel stepped forward, heart thudding. Maggie. She turned. The ladle stilled mid-air. For a moment, her face didn't change, as if her mind hadn't quite caught up. Then her eyes widened, and her breath caught audibly. Daniel. It was barely a whisper. He nodded. They stood there, two people separated by 13 years, and one unforgettable summer, now just a few feet apart in a church basement filled with strangers and pancake syrup. I didn't expect, she began, voice faltering. Neither did I, he said gently. But I heard you last night, playing. She looked down quickly. That was a long time ago. No, he replied softly. It was last night. Someone behind her called for more orange juice. Maggie turned, managed a nod, and passed off the ladle to a teenage volunteer. Could we talk? Daniel asked. Maggie hesitated, then gave a short nod. There's a bench behind the sanctuary. They walked in silence, past murmurs and greetings, out a side door and down a gravel path. The bench sat beneath a dogwood tree, still bare, but beginning to bud. When they sat, Daniel waited. He knew better than to rush this. I thought you were in Dixo, she said finally, staring ahead. I still am. Mostly. Business takes me around. I came here on a whim. She glanced sideways, skeptical. Everhill isn't exactly a detour. No, he admitted, it's not. The silence hung between them, not cold, but tentative, like an old coat being tried on again after too long. You disappeared, Daniel said at last, his voice quiet. One day you were there, then you weren't. I came back from Boston and... She inhaled sharply. Don't. He turned to her. Don't what? Don't make it sound like I just walked away without reason. Then tell me, he said, his voice still calm, because all I had was silence. For years. She looked at him, then really looked. Her eyes weren't angry, but layered, wary, wounded. still holding a story she hadn't told anyone in far too long. I was 19. Daniel, you were headed for law school. Your mother made it very clear I didn't belong in that future. His jaw tightened. My mother. She came to see me, Maggie continued, after you left for your internship, said it was just a summer fling, that you had your life mapped out, and I was a detour. Daniel was silent. I didn't believe her, not at first. Maggie said, but then, weeks passed. You never called, never wrote. I did, he said quickly, almost desperate. I wrote every week. I called your apartment, left messages. I even drove to that little bookstore you worked at. Her brow furrowed. What? Nothing came back. My letters weren't answered. My calls rang dead. She shook her head, disbelief clouding her features. She told me you'd moved on. He added, said you'd left town. There was no forwarding address. Maggie pressed her lips together, her hands clenched in her lap. So, we were both lied to. A wind passed through the branches overhead, scattering old leaves on the path. I kept playing that song, she said suddenly, even when I didn't want to. Every year on the same day, it was the only part of that summer I could hold on to without breaking. He didn't answer right away, but then he said, you weren't alone last night. Her breath caught. I heard his voice. The boy, Caleb. Maggie turned away. That's not a conversation for today. Is he? Daniel's voice faltered. Is he mine? She stood up quickly. I have to get back inside. Maggie. Not now, she said, firmer this time. Please. She didn't wait for a reply, just turned and walked back toward the church. Her pace fast, but steady, like someone holding something fragile they couldn't afford to drop. Daniel remained on the bench, staring at the path she'd taken. The wind picked up again, rustling the bare branches above. In the distance, he heard laughter. The church bell rang 10 sound a. He didn't move for a long time. The rain came in the late afternoon, sudden and steady, the kind that made small towns feel smaller. Daniel stood under the awning of a cafe across from the inn, holding a lukewarm coffee and staring at the empty street. He hadn't called anyone back. Not his COO, not the investors waiting on the Oregon bid, not even his assistant who had sent 3 increasingly urgent messages. His phone sat untouched in his coat pocket, buzzing every now and then like a wasp trapped in wool. But none of it felt real. What did painfully so was the way Maggie had looked at him that morning. Not like a stranger, but not like someone who had ever truly left. Her expression had been carved from something deeper: fatigue, grief, protectiveness, and fear. He'd seen it the flicker in her eyes when he said Caleb's name, a tightening, a withdrawal. It wasn't rejection, exactly, but it was something close. The boy had his last name, not Whitmore Hale, her name. That, too, wasn't an accident. Daniel took a long sip of the bitter coffee. It burned on the way down. You look like a man who just found out the sky isn't blue. The voice came from behind, familiar, dry, grounded. He turned and saw Raymond Archer, his oldest friend from college, standing beneath a dripping umbrella with a knowing half-smile. A psychology professor now still sharp, still graying at the temples in the exact way that made people lean in during lectures. "What the hell are you doing in Everhill?" Daniel asked, startled. "Passing through on the way to Middlebury. Saw your name on the guest book at the inn." He stepped under the awning. "Didn't expect to find you staring into the void." Daniel gave a half laugh, half grimace. "I didn't expect to be doing it either." They stepped inside the cafe. Daniel waved off a refill and sat across from Ray in the corner booth, so Ray prompted after a moment. Daniel exhaled. "She's here. Her Maggie." Ray blinked slowly. "You mean the Maggie?" Daniel nodded. "She was playing piano at a church. I followed the sound like some kind of ghost. And then, there she was." Ray's eyes narrowed, always the analyst. "And she's got a son. Caleb." The silence between them thickened. "Let me guess," Ray said. "About 12, Daniel just looked at him." Ray leaned back. "Damn." I asked if he was mine. Daniel said softly. She didn't answer. Not really, just walked away. What would you do if he is Daniel's hands curled slightly around the coffee mug? I don't know. That's the thing. I don't know anything anymore. That's not true, Ray said. You know what kind of man you become. You know what you value. But this touches a version of you buried a long time ago. Daniel didn't speak, just stared at the raindrops racing down the window. I remember that summer, Ray continued. You came back to campus in the fall a different person. You stopped playing music, cut your hair, took every extra credit course you could find. Daniel gave a short laugh. I told myself it was time to grow up. No, Ray corrected. You told yourself she didn't matter. Daniel's face darkened. I wrote to her. Every week. I called. I never got a reply. Your mother. Daniel nodded slowly. She went to see Maggie. Told her I didn't want her in my life, that I was moving on. She even said Maggie left town without a word, no forwarding address. Ray let out a low whistle. And you believed her. I didn't want to, Daniel said, voice tight. But when the silence stretched, when every letter came back unopened, silence is a weapon too, Ray said gently. Daniel looked up. So what now? Ray's tone softened. You don't get to undo 12 years, Daniel. But you do get to decide what kind of man you want to be next. I'm not trying to force my way in, Daniel said. If Caleb is mine, he deserves to know. Not for drama, not for headlines. Just the truth. And what if Maggie isn't ready? Ray asked. What if the walls she built were the only thing holding her together all this time? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, then I'll wait. But I won't disappear again. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist. A few cars passed by, their tires whispering over wet asphalt. Ray stood and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. You're not the same boy who left for Boston 13 years ago, but maybe that's exactly what this moment needs, a man who's finally ready to listen. Daniel nodded, his jaw set. As they stepped out into the street, his phone buzzed again. He silenced it without looking. Some things could wait, but the truth, that couldn't. The Whitmore estate sat on the northern edge of Fairfield County, a colonial home trimmed in white with black shutters, perched high enough to look down on everything around it, just as Susan Whitmore preferred. Daniel hadn't been back in almost a year. He parked beside the same gravel path he'd raced down on his bike at 10 years old, now lined with imported boxwoods and silence. Everything was still in place, too perfect, too preserved, like a showroom of memories no one had permission to rearrange. He took the front steps slowly. The door opened before he knocked. Daniel, Mrs. Alden, the housekeeper, greeted him with the same practiced warmth as always. Your mother is in the conservatory. Of course she was, where the orchids lived, and the sunlight was always filtered just right. He walked the polished hallways like a man retracing his own history, past family portraits, oil paintings, shelves of books no one read. Susan was seated precisely where he expected, in a tailored navy blouse, sipping tea from fine porcelain. Her silver hair was flawless, her poise unshakable. Daniel, she said, not quite surprised, not quite welcoming. To what do I owe the visit? He remained standing. I saw Maggie. Susan's hand stilled over the saucer. Barely. He didn't sit. You told me she left, that she moved without a word. Susan's gaze lifted, calm, composed. She did. No, Daniel said, voice low, controlled. You lied. The teacup landed gently on the table, not a sound out of place. I advised you, as any mother would, to protect your future. You were 19, headed to Boston. That girl. Her name, Daniel interrupted, is Maggie, and she didn't leave. You drove her away. A flicker, maybe of annoyance, maybe of guilt, passed across Susan's face, but vanished just as fast. I wrote her letters, Daniel said, every week, for months. Did you intercept them? She said nothing. Did you throw them out? Still nothing. He stepped closer, his voice colder now. Did you go to her and lie about what I said? Did you tell her she didn't belong in my life? Susan inhaled slowly, the kind of breath one takes before delivering something difficult or cruel. I did what needed to be done, she said. She was a waitress. Daniel, with no family, no money, no education beyond a community college scholarship. You had a legacy to protect. Daniel's jaw clenched. She played piano, he said. She read poetry. She worked nights because she had no safety net. But she was kind and brilliant, and she loved me. And what would you have done? Susan challenged, voice rising slightly. If she had become pregnant, would you have dropped out of law school, given up your seat at Whitmore and Gray to raise a child in a rented flat? Daniel froze. Silence filled the room. Susan narrowed her eyes. She told you, didn't she? No, Daniel said softly. But you just did. The air left the room. Susan's composure fractured. Not by much, but enough. I saw her last night. Daniel continued. And I heard a boy's voice. His name is Caleb. He's 12. Susan turned away, toward the orchids. So it's true. You knew, I suspected, she admitted. She told me the week after you left. Said she was late. I offered her help. Real help. You offered her money. Susan didn't deny it. She refused. Daniel said. She raised him on her own, while I went on with my life believing she'd walked away. She made her choice, Susan snapped. To keep him, to stay silent. Don't put that entirely on me. You made sure I never got the chance to choose, Daniel replied, his voice hollow. A long pause passed. Then, with more fragility than he'd ever heard in her tone, Susan asked, So, what now? Daniel looked at her, this woman who had shaped him, who had built walls around her heart and called it strength. Now he said, Now I have a son. He turned to leave. Daniel. He paused in the doorway. She'll use him, Susan said flatly, to pull you back into something soft, sentimental. That's not the world you live in. Daniel looked over his shoulder. No, he said. It's the world I should have lived in all along. And then he walked out, past the orchids, past the silence, past the woman who had once decided what love was worth. Outside, the wind had picked up, but Daniel felt steadier than he had in years. The past had been rewritten. Now it was time to reclaim it. It took 2 more days before Maggie agreed to let Daniel meet Caleb. Her message had been short, typed without flourish, just like her Sunday morning, community library garden, 10:30. He's helping with the music program. Come as a visitor, nothing more. Please. Daniel had read it twice, then once more. He understood the unspoken rules. No confessions, no claims, no pressure, just presence. The Everhill Public Library was modest red brick, white trim, and a small children's garden with raised beds, painted rocks, and wind chimes that whispered with the breeze. Beneath a wooden trellis, a small crowd was gathered, parents with coffee cups, folding chairs, a few toddlers picking at dandelions. And there, adjusting the mic stand with careful focus, was a boy in a navy hoodie and scuffed sneakers. Slim, slightly taller than average. His hair was the same deep brown as Maggie's, but his posture straight-backed. Precise, reminded Daniel of his own teenage self. Every movement considered. He watched the boy speak quietly to the librarian, then lift a guitar case and settle onto a stool. The tuning was quick, methodical, like someone who didn't just play music but understood it. Then he played. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. The notes floated into the morning air with a kind of honesty Daniel hadn't heard in years, not in boardrooms, not in speeches, not even in his own life. Just a simple melody, something original, something real. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, letting the music do what words couldn't. When the song ended, the small group clapped politely. A few parents smiled. One toddler let out a gleeful shout that made the boy grin, that smile. Daniel felt it like a jolt. He'd seen it before, years ago, reflected in a mirror, and in a photograph from a family trip to Cape Cod, that crooked lift of the right corner, that half smile of thoughtfulness. Daniel blinked hard. He didn't notice Maggie approach until she was beside him. He wrote that himself, she said, her voice low. Daniel glanced at her. She wore a denim jacket and no makeup. Her eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, but he could hear something in her tone, not pride. Exactly. Something quieter, more cautious. Like someone who'd learned not to hope too loudly. He's talented, Daniel said. He's curious. She replied, about everything. Music, astronomy, how the heart works. He fixes broken electronics for fun, writes lyrics in the margins of his math homework. Daniel almost smiled. That sounds familiar. I figured you'd see it. There was no accusation in her voice, just truth. Maggie crossed her arms. He thinks you're a friend from college, someone I ran into last week. Please don't, I won't. Daniel interrupted gently. Not yet. A beat of silence passed. Then Caleb walked toward them, guitar slung over his back. Mom, he said, brushing hair from his eyes. Miss Carla said I can come back next week and help lead the beginners group. That's great, sweetheart, she replied. This is Mr. Whitmore. We met at the church last Thursday. Caleb turned, polite but slightly guarded. Nice to meet you. Daniel extended a hand. Likewise. You played beautifully. Still learning, Caleb said, eyes steady. It's just something I do for fun. Daniel smiled. Fun is how all great musicians start. Caleb shrugged modestly, but Daniel saw the spark of pride. I used to play a little myself, Daniel added. Caleb's eyes lit with mild curiosity. Guitar, mostly piano, a bit of songwriting, long time ago. Oh, Caleb tilted his head. What kind of stuff? Daniel hesitated, then said carefully, mostly things I never played for anyone but one person. Caleb considered that, then nodded, as if understanding something deeper than what had been said. I like writing stuff too, the boy said. Not sure if it's good. Maggie gave a quiet smile. It's his own language. He's been writing songs since he was 8. Daniel looked at him. Maybe you'll play me something again someday. Caleb shrugged. Maybe. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. The boy walked back toward the trellis where other kids were packing up instruments. Daniel exhaled. She's in him, he said softly. Maggie's brow furrowed. What do you mean, the way he watches, the way he listens? You were like that, too. You never filled a silence just to avoid it. You let it say what it needed to. Maggie didn't answer. Daniel turned to her. Thank you, he said. For what? For raising him with music, for giving him that part of me, even when I didn't know. Maggie looked at him not with softness, but with something close to acceptance. Then, just before she turned away, she said, he has questions. He's always had questions. And one day, they'll be too big to answer with silence. Daniel nodded. I'll be here when that day comes. The air smelled like rain again. They sat in a quiet corner of Maple and Vine, a small cafe tucked into the old train depot near downtown Everhill. Mornings were slow here, mismatched chairs, light jazz humming from speakers, and sunlight spilling through leaded glass. Maggie stirred her tea absently. She hadn't touched it. Daniel sat across from her, hands resting on the table, silent. He didn't press. Not yet. Outside. A school bus rumbled past. A mother passed the window pushing a stroller. Life moved on. But inside, something was about to be unburied. You want the truth, Maggie said, her voice even. I want whatever you're ready to give, Daniel replied. She looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, just exhaustion. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you left, she began. I didn't panic, not at first. I told myself you'd be back in a few months. We'd talk, figure it out. She paused. Her fingers trembled slightly, but then the letters stopped. The calls never came. I left messages. I sent one letter to your dorm, then another. No answer. Daniel's throat tightened. I never got them. I thought maybe you were overwhelmed, or scared, or maybe. She hesitated. Maybe your mother had gotten to you, but I had no proof, only silence. She took a slow breath. So I did what I had to. I dropped out of school, moved back to Everhill, waitressed during the day, stocked shelves at the grocery at night, played piano at the church once a week just to keep the music alive. Daniel blinked, the weight of each word pressing deeper. My landlord gave me 2 months of grace, Maggie continued. After that, I moved into a friend's basement until Caleb was born. Her voice cracked for the first time. I had no one. Daniel. My father had died 2 years before. My mother, well, you remember. She hadn't spoken to me since I was 16. I should have been there, Daniel said, voice hoarse. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but steady. You weren't, but I didn't hate you for it. I just told myself I wouldn't raise Caleb in bitterness. I wouldn't pass on silence, disguised as strength. Daniel swallowed hard. Your mother, Maggie said. She showed up the week after I told the bookstore manager I was expecting. Word traveled fast in a small town. She came in, sat down across from me at the counter, ordered chamomile tea like she belonged there. Daniel could see it. Susan, composed, cool, calculating. She said you'd moved on. Maggie continued, that you were in deep sea, now, already involved with someone else, that the letters and calls were a phase, that you didn't want to be tied down. Daniel's jaw clenched. She lied. She offered me money, Maggie said, enough to leave town, disappear, start over somewhere more appropriate. Her words, and you didn't take it. Maggie laughed bitterly. No, I was young and scared, but I wasn't for sale. A long silence followed. I worked 3 jobs for almost 8 years. She said, Caleb never went without food or books or warmth, but we didn't have much more than that. He's never had a birthday party at a trampoline park. He's never been on a plane. Daniel looked down, guilt hitting him like a slow burn. He's never asked for much, Maggie added, but he's always asked why. Why he didn't have a dad. Why I never talked about the man I once loved. Daniel looked up. You loved me, he asked softly. Maggie met his gaze, unwavering. I never stopped. Silence wrapped around them again, this time softer, not choking, but sacred. Daniel leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't choose to leave you, Maggie. I didn't choose to abandon our son. That choice was made for me. But I swear to you now, I'll do everything I can to make sure he never feels that kind of absence again. Maggie didn't cry. She didn't nod. She just looked at him for a long moment and said, then don't start by being his father. Start by being someone he trusts. Daniel nodded slowly. I can do that. Outside. The rain finally began to fall, but inside that little cafe, something had shifted, not everything healed. Not yet, but a wound had been opened and cleaned, and perhaps, in time, could begin to close. The day was cooler than usual for early spring. Clouds had gathered low, dimming the light over Everhill's modest downtown like a heavy thought pressing down. Daniel sat on a park bench near the edge of town, watching the slow movement of people, the breeze catching corners of newspapers, the quiet normalcy of a world he'd been too busy to know existed. 12 years. That number echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. 12 years of success, of meetings, mergers, properties bought and sold, public speeches, renewable energy initiatives, all built carefully, efficiently layer upon layer of purpose. And yet not a single one of those achievements could stand against the sound of a boy's voice calling Maggie Mom, or the memory of fingers pressed to guitar strings with uncanny familiarity. Daniel had built an empire, but missed a childhood. He met Caleb again the next afternoon, at the Everhill Community Center, where Maggie volunteered once a week. It was quiet, save for a few kids playing chess and a couple of seniors puzzling over a jigsaw in the corner. Caleb was seated cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a bin of old audio cables and guitar straps. He didn't notice Daniel walk in until a shadow crossed the mat. Hey, Daniel said, crouching down. Need a hand. Caleb looked up, surprised, then gave a short nod. Yeah, these are a mess. Daniel sat, letting the silence hang for a beat before reaching into the bin. They worked without speaking for a few minutes. Daniel liked the way Caleb organized things quiet, intentional. Maggie had said he liked systems, patterns. He probably saw the world in terms of connection points, the same way Daniel once did with chords and melodies before spreadsheets took over. "You play every week?" Daniel asked gently. "Most weeks," Caleb replied. "Miss Carla lets me help teach when there's a full group. Sometimes just a warm-up song." Daniel nodded. "I used to help teach too, long time ago. I wasn't very good at it." Caleb grinned. "You don't look like you'd be bad at anything." Daniel chuckled, surprised by the compliment. "Trust me, I've had some pretty rough performances. Once froze in the middle of a duet and walked off stage. For real." "Oh yeah, I was 14. Never forgot it." Caleb tilted his head. "So why'd you stop?" Daniel paused. The question hit harder than it should have. "I guess I got busy," he said. "Life happened. Responsibilities. I convinced myself music was a luxury I couldn't afford." Caleb didn't respond right away. Then he said, "That sounds sad." Daniel looked at him. The boy wasn't being rude, just honest. "It was," Daniel admitted, "but I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was doing the right thing." Caleb looked back down at the cables. "Sometimes I think about quitting music." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Why, I don't know. Everyone says it's just a hobby, that I should focus on real things. Be something serious." "What do you think?" Daniel asked. Caleb shrugged. "I think music's the only time my brain doesn't feel too full." Daniel sat back slightly, the words sinking in. He remembered being 12, overthinking everything, wanting to fix the world, but not knowing how. Music had been his one safe space until it wasn't. "I think you should keep playing," Daniel said softly. "Not because it'll make you rich, or famous, or any of that, but because it helps you stay you." Caleb smiled faintly. "That's what Mom says. She's smart. She's tired." Daniel's chest ached. "She tries to hide it," Caleb continued, fiddling with a strap buckle. "But I hear her at night sometimes, just sitting, like she's holding something heavy." Daniel nodded slowly. "She's carried more than anyone should ever have to." Caleb looked up at him, eyes curious. "You care about her?" The question was so direct, Daniel almost didn't know how to answer. "Yes," he said at last. "I did. I do. Always." Caleb studied him. "Are you going to stay?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I'd like to." Even if things get messy, Daniel looked into the boy's eyes, and said, "Especially then." Another long pause. Then Caleb said, "You talk like someone who lost something, not like someone who wants to take something." Daniel smiled, deeply moved. "That's because I did, and I don't want to take anything. I just want to find my way back to it." Caleb nodded, slowly, then handed Daniel a coiled guitar cable. "This one works." Daniel took it gently, like a gift. For the first time, it felt like a door had opened, not wide, not all the way, but enough to let in the beginning of something. Trust, time, and maybe, one day, truth. Maggie stood by the doorway of the community center, arms crossed, half hidden behind the wall of the art supply closet. She could hear Caleb laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like months. She peeked around the edge, just enough to see him sitting on the floor beside Daniel. A tangle of old guitar cables stretched out between them. They looked like a puzzle only they could solve together. Their heads were close, their movements mirroring one quiet, focused, the other relaxed, present. It was uncanny. Not just the way they looked alike, though that had become impossible to ignore. It was something else. The timing of their smiles, the dry wit, the deliberate way they both avoided eye contact when emotions got too close to the surface. They're not strangers, she thought. They never were. Later that evening, in her kitchen, Maggie stirred a pot of lentil stew while Caleb sat at the counter scribbling notes in a spiral notebook. It was one of those small, peaceful evenings, the kind she both cherished and feared, because peace often made her heart brace for what might break it. "Mom," Caleb said without looking up, "did you know Mr. Whitmore used to write songs. Her spoon paused mid-stir. I did. He told me about one where he froze on stage during a duet, walked right off in the middle of a verse. Maggie smiled, faintly. He told me that story, too, a long time ago. Caleb grinned. I kind of want to hear that song now. You might, she said softly. One day. A few moments passed. Then he asked, why didn't you ever tell me you knew him before Maggie's hand slowed? The question had come sooner than she expected, but not sooner than she feared. I wanted to, she said, turning to face him. I just didn't know how to explain everything. When you were little, I thought I was protecting you. But now, Caleb looked up, his eyes steady. You don't have to protect me from him. That simple sentence lodged in her chest like a stone. I'm not, she whispered. But wasn't she? The next weekend, Caleb invited Daniel to sit in on one of the music classes at the community center. Maggie had hesitated before saying yes, not because she didn't trust Daniel, but because she did, and trust was so much harder than anger. She watched from the hallway as Daniel sat cross-legged among a half-circle of kids, strumming gently on an old acoustic guitar. Caleb sat to his right, eyes glowing, waiting for his cue like a musician waiting for downbeat. And when they played soft, simple, imperfect, it wasn't just music. It was repair. It was reach. It was reunion in disguise. The children clapped. A few giggled. Daniel laughed with them, unguarded. Caleb glanced at him and smiled, not a polite smile, but one that reached into his whole face. And Maggie felt something shift, not in them, in her. That night, she found herself in the attic. Dusty boxes, old sweaters, the kind of forgotten storage every single mother accumulates over time, because letting go of anything feels too risky. She pulled out an old wooden box, dark mahogany, small brass latch, and opened it carefully. Inside were yellowed letters, a faded concert ticket, and a CD with a Sharpie label that read, "For when the silence is too loud." Daniel had made it for her the week before he left for Boston. She never played it again after the second week of him not writing back. Not because she didn't want to, but because it hurt too much. She sat down on the attic floor, legs crossed like Caleb earlier that day, and stared at the CD in her palm. After a long moment, she closed the box. The next morning, she put it in Caleb's backpack. When Daniel opened the door that evening, he didn't expect Caleb to be standing on his porch. "Hey," the boy said. "Mom had a thing. I asked if I could come drop this off." He handed Daniel the CD. Daniel turned it in his hand slowly, reading the faded label. His throat tightened. "I think she kept it," Caleb said, almost as an afterthought. "A long time." Daniel swallowed. "You know what's on it?" Caleb shook his head. "Not yet." "Thought maybe we could listen together?" Daniel stepped aside, letting him in. "I'd like that," he said quietly. The boy walked in like he'd been there before. In some way, maybe he had. The invitation came in the form of a white envelope, hand-delivered to Daniel's office in Burlington. He hadn't been back long, just a 2-day trip to Solterra's headquarters to check in, reassure the board, and remind himself briefly of the life he used to think he wanted. The envelope bore no logo, no return address, just his name in his mother's handwriting, elegant and unmistakable. Inside was a card: Sunday dinner, 6:00, home. Bring clarity. Mother Daniel stared at the words for a long time. They didn't ask. They instructed. He arrived just before 6. The Whitmore estate was lit softly, candles in the windows, silver polished on the dining room table. Susan always knew how to stage a scene. Presentation, for her, had never been about comfort. It was control disguised as civility. She greeted him in the foyer, kiss on the cheek, the scent of lavender and steel in her wake. They made small talk at first, about the state of politics, a fundraiser she was planning, the rising costs of imported orchids. Daniel let her speak. He waited, until the soup course was cleared, and the second glass of Cabernet had barely been touched. Then she said it. "So, you've reconnected with her." Daniel didn't react. "Her name is Maggie." Susan gave a quiet, cool smile. Names don't change history. No, he said, but the truth does. Susan set her wine glass down with a soft clink. I've heard things, she said, about a boy, about your visits to Everhill, about your absences from work. There's concern. Concern from whom, Daniel asked. You or the board members you still control. Does it matter? Susan replied. Perception is reality. You know that. You built your entire company on it. Daniel leaned back. This isn't about perception. It's about my son. She exhaled, eyes narrowing. So, you believe her. I don't need to believe her, Daniel said, voice steady. I see him. I see myself in him. Susan's face remained composed, but her tone tightened. Do you understand what this could do? To you, to us, to everything we've built. You mean what you've built, Daniel said, what you've tried to preserve like some antique family crest, even if it meant erasing people. She was a waitress, Susan snapped, with no family, no social leverage, no understanding of what it means to be us. She was the only person who ever made me feel like being me was enough. That silenced the room. A log cracked in the fireplace. Wind whispered against the stained glass windows. Susan stood and walked toward the mantel, adjusting a photo of Daniel with his father. He would be disappointed, she said. No, Daniel said quietly. He would be ashamed of you. She turned slowly, her eyes gleaming with that particular coldness he remembered from childhood scoldings and scholarship galas. I made you, she said. Every inch of your life has been curated to succeed. I'm not a product, he replied, and I'm not a child anymore. Susan stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. You think this is about love, about redemption. It's not. It's about consequence. The second you claim that boy, you invite questions about your past, about hers, about mine. Daniel froze. He stared at her, something dawning in his expression. You knew, he said. You knew the truth about Caleb all these years. Susan didn't answer. Instead, she said, don't throw your legacy away for a moment of sentiment. Daniel stood, slowly. I'm not throwing it away, he said. I'm choosing something that was never for sale to begin with. Susan looked at him like one looks at a stranger across glass. Then she said, if you go through with this, I won't protect you. Daniel nodded. Good. I don't need protection anymore. That night, he drove back to Everhill in silence. No radio, no calls, just the road, the stars, and the weight of a storm that was no longer just coming, it had already arrived. But this time, Daniel wasn't running from it. He was driving into it wide-eyed, spine straight, and finally, ready. It started with a voice behind a half-closed door. Maggie had stepped out to take a call. Daniel was in the kitchen rinsing dishes from their early dinner, just the three of them, pasta and laughter and soft background jazz. Caleb had said he wanted to get something from the front room and wandered down the hall, but the door to Maggie's study hadn't latched completely, and her voice had carried. He's his father. Susan, you don't get to erase that anymore. Caleb had only meant to grab his sketchbook, but the words stopped him cold. The phone speaker was muffled, but Daniel's mother's name was unmistakable. So were the next words. Maggie said, you already took one future from him. You won't take Caleb. His hand on the doorknob tightened. He stepped back slowly, the hallway suddenly feeling longer, darker. The puzzle pieces he'd quietly collected over the past few weeks rearranged themselves this time into a shape he couldn't unsee. The eyes, the way Daniel listened, the way he moved. Not just a friend, not just someone from Mom's past. His father. By the time Maggie returned to the kitchen, Caleb was gone. She found Daniel on the porch, wiping his hands on a dish towel, face calm, too calm. I think he heard you, Daniel said. Her breath caught. When I saw the study door open, I think he was standing there. She rushed back inside, calling his name, scanning the rooms. Panic rose like a tide. Then she saw the screen door swinging at the back of the house. He'd left. Daniel grabbed his coat. I'll find him. They found him 20 minutes later, sitting on the edge of the old train trestle just outside of town, legs dangling above the shallow creek. His hood was up, shoulders hunched. Maggie approached first, slowly. "Caleb," she called gently. He didn't move. Daniel hung back, hands in his pockets, heart pounding in his chest like a drum. Maggie sat beside her son, silent for a long moment. "I didn't mean for you to find out that way," she said softly. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." Caleb didn't respond. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "please say something." His voice came low, measured. "Is it true?" Maggie nodded slowly. "Yes." He looked up then, his face pale but dry. "How long have you known?" She hesitated. "Since before you were born." His jaw clenched, but his voice didn't rise. "And you didn't think I deserved to know I was trying to protect you," Maggie said, from what he snapped not with rage, but heartbreak. From him, or from the truth. Daniel stepped closer, his voice steady. "From me, Caleb. She was trying to protect you from me, or the version of me she thought I had become." Caleb turned to him, eyes sharp. "Are you really my dad?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The boy stood suddenly, pulling his hood down, hair tousled in the breeze. "For how long have you known?" Daniel looked at him. No excuses in his eyes. Just regret. "A few weeks." Caleb laughed one sharp, bitter breath. "That's it, I didn't know." Caleb: "I didn't even know you existed until I saw you at the church that night. But from the moment I heard your voice, I felt something I didn't understand. I'm trying. I'm here." Caleb looked away. "Too late." "No," Daniel said quietly. "Just late." A long silence followed. Maggie stepped back, giving them space she didn't know how to fill. Daniel moved closer. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I don't want to replace anything or anyone. I just want the chance to know you, to earn whatever comes next." Caleb didn't respond right away. Then he said, "Why would I trust someone who didn't know I existed?" "Because," Daniel said, "I'm not walking away now. Even if you never call me Dad, even if you never forgive me, I'll still be here." Caleb's lip trembled. He wiped it quickly, angry at himself for feeling anything. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly. Daniel blinked. What Caleb stared at the stream below. "That CD you gave me, that was you. Right. The last track. Piano piece. It was yours." Daniel swallowed. "Yeah. It was." Caleb nodded once. "It was really good." A pause. Then the boy turned, slowly, and said, "If I teach you the song I'm working on, will you play with me?" Daniel nodded, voice cracking. "I'd be honored." Maggie exhaled, tears running silently down her cheeks. The truth had fallen, not with fury, but like rain. Hard, honest, cleansing. And maybe, just maybe, it had cleared the sky. Sunday morning broke with a pale, golden light. The town of Everhill stirred slowly. Church bells rang faintly in the distance. At the Hale house, windows glowed softly with warmth from the kitchen, where the smell of banana bread lingered in the air. Maggie stood at the sink, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair loosely pinned. She wasn't thinking about laundry, or the week ahead, or the piano recital coming up. She was thinking about them. The night before had been raw, but honest. A truth uncovered not by design, but by life's inevitable momentum. And yet, when Caleb returned from the bridge, he didn't slam the door. He didn't retreat to his room. He said only, "I'm tired, Mom, but I think I'm okay." That was enough. In the living room, Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, sheet music scattered around him. Daniel sat on the old piano bench, running a warm-up scale with a cautious grace, as if reacquainting himself with a former version of himself. "It's in E minor," Caleb said, "but I like sneaking in that D major at the end of the second verse. Kinda unexpected." Daniel grinned, a surprise resolve, bold. "You think it's too much? No. I think it's honest. And that makes it work." Caleb nodded and began to strum quietly, humming a few notes, then pausing to scribble something in the margin. Maggie stood in the doorway, arms crossed lightly, not from distance, but from awe. They weren't just playing. They were listening to each other. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was real, and it was theirs. Later, over lunch. Daniel asked Caleb about his favorite musicians. The boy launched into a passionate list that included everything from the Beatles to Bon Iver to a quirky YouTuber who mixed jazz with Nintendo sounds. Maggie laughed. Don't forget the Icelandic cello rock band. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's a thing. Oh yeah, Caleb said. They're weird and amazing. They talked about lyrics, about how hard it is to find the right word that feels true, about the way melodies sometimes arrive in dreams and vanish before morning. Maggie watched them from across the table, this boy she had raised and the man she had once loved. There was a moment, mid-sentence, when Daniel reached for his glass and brushed his hand against Caleb's without even noticing, and Caleb didn't flinch. He smiled. Tiny things, but everything. That afternoon, they walked to the old chapel where Maggie still played on Thursday evenings. Daniel hadn't stepped foot inside since the night he first heard her again. She offered him the piano. Go ahead. See if it still fits. He sat, ran his hands across the keys. They were slightly out of tune, like life. Then he began to play. It was slow at first, tentative. Then, as Caleb joined in with soft strumming, the room warmed with harmony, not perfect, but true. It was the song Caleb had written with Daniel, now layering chords that echoed Maggie's influence. 2, a melody made by 3 people who had once lived in separate key signatures, now slowly finding the same rhythm. Maggie sat in the pew and let herself feel it. Not fear, not regret, just music. Afterward, as they locked up, Caleb turned to Daniel and said, "That was the first time I played with anyone who didn't try to lead everything." Daniel smiled. "That's the secret to a good duet. Listen more than you play." Caleb nodded. "Think we can do it again next week." Daniel looked at Maggie. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away. Daniel turned back to Caleb. "Yeah, I'd like that." That night, Maggie found herself standing by the window, holding a worn photo of Daniel at 19, the one she had kept. Hidden in the back of a drawer, in it, he was barefoot, guitar slung over his shoulder, laughing mid-note. Now, in the other room, he slept in the guest bed, one door down from Caleb, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a place where something was missing. It felt like a beginning, not a perfect one, but a beautiful, unfinished song. The town square of Everhill had never looked so alive. Paper lanterns swayed above strings of warm light. Folding chairs lined the modest wooden stage set up in front of the courthouse steps. A banner, hand-painted by the local middle schoolers, read, "Spring Celebration, a Night of Music and Stories." It wasn't a gala, it wasn't a festival, but it felt like a turning point. Daniel stood behind the stage, adjusting the buttons on his flannel shirt. He wasn't used to performing anymore. His last time on stage was probably during his second year of college, nervous, sweaty palms, staring into spotlights and trying not to forget the second verse. But tonight was different. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was playing with someone. Caleb stood beside him, tuning his guitar, calm, focused. "You good?" Daniel asked, watching him. Caleb shrugged, a little nervous. Daniel smiled. "Good. Means it matters." The boy looked up, eyes searching. "You nervous?" Daniel thought for a second. More grateful than nervous. Caleb gave a half smile. "Me too." From the front row, Maggie sat with a paper cup of cider between her hands. She wore a soft navy sweater and the necklace Daniel had given her 13 years ago, a silver eighth note on a thin chain. She hadn't worn it since. The mayor finished his cheerful speech, thanking local volunteers, before announcing, "And now, something special." A song written by one of our own, performed by 2 generations, meeting somewhere in the middle. There was light applause. Then Daniel and Caleb walked on stage. It wasn't dramatic, no spotlight, just the 2 of them, one carrying a guitar, the other sitting down at the upright piano brought in from the church. Daniel leaned toward the mic. "This song's about silence," he said simply. And what happens when it's broken the right way? Then they played. The melody was soft, beginning with finger-picked chords from Caleb. Then Daniel joined in piano notes rolling like river stones, smooth, intentional. The song had no chorus, just a slow, building sequence that rose and fell like breath. People listened, really listened, not just to the music but to them. And in that quiet, under the soft glow of lanterns and April stars, something clicked. Daniel wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a man with a complicated past. He was a father, learning, listening, playing his part. And Caleb wasn't just a boy with talent. He was his son, a bridge between what had been lost and what could still be found. When the last note faded, there was a stillness, then applause, not thunderous, but full of something warmer. Caleb looked sideways at Daniel and whispered, "We didn't mess up." Daniel laughed softly. "I told you, music remembers." Afterward, neighbors came to shake hands, offer compliments, share cookies wrapped in napkins. Miss Carla from the library cried a little. Even the mayor offered to book them for next year. But the moment that mattered most came later, when Maggie walked up beside them, hands in her coat pockets, and simply said, "You both made something beautiful tonight." Daniel met her gaze. "We had a good teacher." She smiled. "You both did." Then Caleb, never one for drama, just looked up at them and said, "Can we go home?" And they did, together, back at the house. Caleb went straight to his room, mumbling something about needing to write down new lyrics before he forgot. Maggie and Daniel stood in the kitchen, the kettle humming quietly between them. "You stayed," she said. Daniel nodded. "I meant it when I said I would." She turned toward him. "So now what?" He took a moment before answering. "We write the next verse," he said, "one day at a time." Maggie didn't reply with words. Instead, she stepped forward, rested her forehead gently against his chest, and closed her eyes. And he wrapped his arms around her, careful, present, still. The music had never really left. It had just been waiting. For this. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are not from what was said, but from what was taken away in silence. Daniel, Maggie, and Caleb remind us that love doesn't always arrive at the perfect time, but it's never too late to choose it again. That behind every unanswered question, there may be a truth that was hidden, not by fate, but by fear, or pride, or prejudice. And maybe the hardest part isn't forgiving the past. It's believing that we're worthy of starting over. But let this story also serve as a quiet protest against the walls we build around status, against the quiet, polite ways people decide who is worthy and who is not. Because every child deserves the truth, every love deserves a chance, and every human being deserves to be seen not by the weight of their last name, but by the light in their soul. If this story moved you, even just a little, like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to Shining Stories, because this isn't the end. It's only the beginning. And the next story might just be yours.